Assalamu alaikum. Good evening in Dhaka and good morning for Akhtar Bhai who's dialing in from New York. It's New York, isn't it?
Well, it's in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. It's in
Suburbs
Maryland.
of Washington, D.C. Okay. Um, Dear viewers and listeners, welcome to another episode of Brain Conversation. Brain standing for Bangladesh Research, Analysis and Information Network. Um, Today we have Syed Akhtar Mahmood, an economist by vocation, um, formerly of the World Bank, and a keen observer of Bangladesh's development trajectory. Um, Welcome to the show, Akhtar Bhai.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this show.
Okay. So these conversations, Akhtar Bhai, are very much a conversation. So it's not an interview. We would like to talk about, obviously Bangladesh's development trajectory, but the idea is not to talk about what's on the news. The idea is to have a deeper conversation
Right.
that can have a shelf life, right? So if we
Mhm.
come back in 6 months, there's still something interesting here that that's the big picture idea. But
Mhm.
you know, as a hook, we are going to start with things that are happening around us, right? So,
Sure. Sure.
globally, obviously, it's very difficult to escape the trade wars or tariff wars or whatever we call these things. Um, both the U.S. and then China, slapping on tariffs on each other's goods. And locally, we have probably a bit better news in that we just had the investment summit
Mhm. Mhm.
and there has been a lot of talks around that. Um, but from textbook, right? We know that capital should flow where there is profit. So why do we need to have a big investment show? Why wouldn't capital just flow if there's profit opportunity? And similarly, that okay, so Trump has whacked tariff, why does China need to retaliate? I mean, the old saying was that if somebody else has a bad harbor, you don't put rocks on your own, right?
Mhm.
So, okay, so what are we missing? Why do countries, we see interventions all the time, right? Um, why do we do that? And bringing it back to Bangladesh, is this something, activist interventionist policy? Is this something for development? Is this something that's needed? Is it something? How do you see the whole thing?
Okay. Well, let me start with the investment summit. You mentioned the profit opportunities, but there's also the risk side of the coin, right? So the profits will have to be seen as expected profits. And when you talk of expectations, you factor in the risks. And a lot of the risks emanate from what we call informational asymmetries. So an investor may see some attraction in the Bangladesh economy, but his or her information on the economy may have gaps, and they want to come and fill in the gaps as much as they can. And we know that there's nothing which substitutes an actual visit to a country, and more importantly, the face-to-face conversations that you can have with a lot of people when you come to an event like this. So I would talk about the informational asymmetry as something which investors need to address. And also the countries which are trying to encourage investors, they would also have to solve this asymmetry problem because they know much more than what the investors do, at least initially. So I think the combination of risks and information asymmetry is a reason why you have to go for these kind of proactive steps, whether it's having events in your country or going and targeting investors and making a pitch for your country. So the profits which they see from a distance is probably not enough to give them the comfort to come and actually make the investments. And we also know, and I just in an interview with the Business Standard, I just mentioned this, that there are many bridges to cross between coming to a summit and actual investment. So even coming to a summit doesn't lead to a firm decision to invest. That's sort of the beginning of the process.
Uh,
On the
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
you also mentioned the trade wars, and of course we're only seeing the beginning. And if you allow me to paraphrase Churchill, we have certainly not seen the end, not even the beginning of the end. And I'm not even sure we have seen the end of the
End
beginning.
of the beginning. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, retaliations are not uncommon, at least as a negotiation step. So I think China is quite aware of the dangers posed by retaliations and retaliations which ratchet up. So this could be seen as perhaps a negotiating step.
Right. Um, you mentioned that there are many bridges to cross between a summit
Mhm.
and actual investment. Is there a literature on that? Not just sort of presumably Bangladesh is not the only country that does this. So is there a literature that sort of estimates a success rate or
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. There is indeed one. And I think it talks about a ratio of around 25 to 30% of the investments on which initial interest is shown. And initial interest could be attending a summit or even sending some indication that we'd like to invest. So globally, that seems to be the average figure, that around 25 to 30% is actually realized.
right,
Now, we don't know what the ratio is for Bangladesh. It's because we don't keep a good data on how many investors actually wanted to come, what are the numbers that they were initially talking about. Maybe the registrations in BIDA, because that's an important step. If we take the registrations as an indication, then maybe we can calculate how much we have actually got over the years. But it's quite possible that there are many who had shown an interest and didn't even bother to register. And that's why I also talked about this investor tracking system,
right,
where you start with those who have shown an initial interest, and you can define that in terms of attendance at a summit. And then you identify the various bridges to be crossed. And then you track what happened with these investors, how many of them crossed which bridge. And then you can come to that figure and see whether Bangladesh is closer to the global average or is actually significantly less than that.
right. Who would be a country that we could reasonably benchmark against? Because global average might not be a good benchmark for us to begin with.
Right. Well, in terms of somewhat similar initial conditions, you can think of somewhat similar, it's not similar. Vietnam, Turkey, countries like this, you can go and have a look at what their
Right.
success rates have been.
Right.
Maybe India, but Turkey and Vietnam, in some ways, they are reasonably successful cases. We also want to benchmark against those who have had some success,
Right.
not the very poor performers either.
Yeah. So Turkey now or Turkey 50 years ago or something? Because Turkey now is a um, you know much more advanced than us, presumably.
No, maybe you start, let's say you go back about 20 years.
Right.
So you can start the Turkey journey about 20 years ago and then see what was their ratio at that time. And it could be much less than the global average, and then see what has happened over time.
Welcome, Shofik, by the way. So you've been listening. So, sort of feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no, right now I don't have a question. I'm waiting for for next parts. Please carry on.
Sure. Okay. Um, okay. So if we think about Vietnam, for example, right? So yeah, if we go back 10 years, 15 years ago, they probably had a export bucket very similar to ours. In fact, they still, they're still our direct competitor in ready-made garments, right? But they have also, gone ahead and done other things that
Mhm.
we don't seem to have done, right? So would you say, is this, and then we also know that our FDI, you know, as a share of GDP is much
Mhm.
smaller than Vietnam's, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So would that suggest that we have not, I mean, is it because we have been unable to do these summits properly, or there are, bigger, more structural issues at play? Um, why haven't
Yeah.
we,
Yeah.
we have been doing garments for a while now, right?
Sure, sure, sure. Okay. On Vietnam, I mean, if you go back about what 30 years or so, the early 90s, and I looked at the export composition of Bangladesh vis-a-vis Vietnam. So at that time, the electronics export of electronics goods as percentage of their total exports was the same in both countries, under 1%. And in
Right.
absolute terms, in fact, we were probably exporting a bit more than Vietnam around in the early 90s. Now, Vietnam's electronics exports are about 40% of their total exports. So while we are competing with them in garments and they're a major player in garments, actually they've become a very important player in electronics. And
Right.
their export basket has become much more sophisticated.
Mm.
Our proportion has actually gone down. So it was below 1%, has gone down even more, right? So that's a very stark contrast. And if you uh, put those figures in a chart, which I did some time back, and you then bring in the chart on FDI, you'll start seeing part of the reason or a large part of the reason, which you just alluded to. So
Mm.
our FDI as percentage of GDP has remained below 2%. Often it was less. In recent years, it had gone up, but certainly not like the 5, 6, 7, 8% that Vietnam has averaged over probably the last 20 years, right? Now, of course, Vietnam did not have many private enterprises, domestic private enterprises to start with, and they opted for a FDI-led development. We have, of course, a reasonably good base of domestic entrepreneurs, but there are many good reasons why it's important to attract foreign investors. And one important reason is that if you want to diversify your exports, and if you particularly go into more sophisticated products like electronics, you need investors who have not only the capital. Capital is probably the less of our problems because many of our firms do have quite a bit of capital. I'm discounting the importance of capital inflow, but the technological knowledge, the managerial knowledge, the brand name, and the foothold that these investors already have in global markets is something which our domestic entrepreneurs don't. So therefore, the objective of export diversification is, I think, quite intimately linked with this challenge of FDI attraction. So now that brings me to the other part of your question, or the main part of your question, as to why we are not being able to attract. And is it that the summits are not being done well? No, I think the summits, not just this one, even previous summits, may have done a reasonably good job of getting people together and presenting the country, although I always thought there was a scope to do more. Um, and this time the government has said they're doing it differently from before. So for example, instead of just having presentations and speeches, they've arranged a lot of interactive sessions where investors can address the problem that I mentioned before, which is informational asymmetry in a better way than if you're just listening to a presentation. The problem is the follow-up. The problem is the follow-up. And there are two aspects of it. One is the broader investment climate and the problems there. And the other is the one I mentioned, that investors come and then you have to track them and see, are they stuck somewhere? And if it is, why? Is it that they're not getting the land? Is it that they're not getting approvals somewhere? Is it that they were promised certain tax benefits and NBR is now not cooperating? NBR is coming up with reasons why they don't want to give. And these are all things that have actually happened in practice. So I'm not saying this conceptually. These are things that have happened in Bangladesh in practice. So finding out where they're stuck and resolving those problems, we have not been good at that. That's one thing. And the other is, of course, a set of problems in our investment climate. And I remember the World Bank Group did a survey of about 700 CEOs of multinational corporations a few years ago, asking them, what are the factors which encourage or discourage you from investing in a developing country? And one of the items at the top was policy and regulatory uncertainty. And investors, if you tell them yes or no, they're happy. If you keep on saying maybe, if you keep them in a limbo, they're not happy, right? And we have serious problems of policy and regulatory uncertainty, which also has deeper roots, which brings me to another problem, and I'll stop there for the time being, which is coordination within government. So FDI attraction has to be seen as a whole of government agenda. And I often say, what can BIDA do if suddenly Bangladesh Bank starts restricting profit repatriation because there is some shortage of foreign exchange? Or what can BIDA do if NBR suddenly imposes a tax on a foreign investor with retroactive effect? And all these have actually happened in Bangladesh.
Shafiq, you've got question. I have questions too, but Shafiq, you go first. You're on mute.
So, Akhtar, you stop there, but when you read about the literature and you follow that, you know that the East Asian development model that from Japan to then Korea, China, Taiwan, all the countries went through, and now Vietnam is probably following the same trajectory, attracting a lot of FDI and also um, exporting. And they say that the critical difference that those development models and the other parts of the world is state capacity. You mentioned about the coordination externality or the coordination problem that that governments, is it just our failure of you said that inefficient government, or is it something like inherent in our capacity that government couldn't coordinate, couldn't impose its will upon coordinate for a particular purpose, that this industry is coming, that we will coordinate all our legal and all other activities together to serve that purpose, that Vietnam can do well. Maybe it's because of their administrative legacy or any other different reason. But what do you see, that is it just because that we have a corrupt government, or because Vietnam is not, I would say that it's not a very non-corrupt country. Those countries are similarly, they have corruption problem, but still they manage to seems to solve this coordination problem for foreign investment quite efficiently compared to us. So where do you see the main difference between maybe Vietnam and Bangladesh?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Shafiq. I would begin by making a distinction between two kinds of coordination problems. So one is the one I was referring to and which you referred to as well, which is the coordination within government between different ministries and agencies. But there's another coordination problem that's talked about in the development literature, and it has been mentioned in the context of the countries that you mentioned, the East Asian countries, which is a coordination between government actions and private sector actions. So let me give an example of something which is still in a nascent stage, but is being discussed, which is prospects of Bangladesh entering the semiconductor value chain. So we are already doing some work on chip design. Experts talk about possibilities in the assembling and testing part of the manufacturing segment of semiconductors, which Malaysia, Philippines have already gone into. Now, for that, we need skilled people, not so much for assembly and testing, but certainly for chip design, good software engineers. Now, the private sector can come and say, or the government can ask the private sector, including foreign investors, to come and invest big time, okay? And then the investors will say, okay, I can come and invest big time, but what is the guarantee that in the next 5 years, I'm going to get the supply of skilled engineers that I need? And then the government goes to the universities and says, okay, we have good prospects in the semiconductor industry, but they need, thousands of skilled engineers. Why don't you plan to produce this many engineers over the next 4 or 5 years? And then universities will say, but what is the guarantee that they will all get jobs, right? So both parties have this problem of not being fully confident about what the other party is going to do. So this is where you have another kind of coordination problem. And this is where, therefore, there could be case for some public intervention. So whether it's subsidies given to the universities, or maybe some guarantee by government that if that they will make a special effort to make sure that these jobs are indeed created. And similarly, a guarantee to the private sector that they will be working with these universities to ensure that the skilled personnel are there. So that's a different coordination problem, and that also requires a reasonably effective government. But if we come back to the original coordination problem that I mentioned, which is within the government, and you talked about state capacity. Now, Jyoti mentioned at the introduction that I'm observing Bangladesh, I try to observe Bangladesh's development trajectory. And in fact, one of the things I'm trying to do is to look at the history of policymaking in Bangladesh, because things have happened. It's not that reforms haven't happened. We often make very sweeping comments that nothing has happened in Bangladesh. No, the growth that we have achieved, which is not insignificant, even after you account for the possible miscalculations or exaggerations that the white paper, for example, talked about. Even after you account for that, the growth that we have had for several decades is still quite remarkable, given the very poor initial conditions we had. Now, I'm developing a sort of storyline where I'm saying that this growth happened because of the interaction between three worlds. You have the world of entrepreneurs, and that starts from small farmers all the way to the conglomerates, the world of policy, and there's an intermediating world of what I call the world of ideas, debates, and discourses, where experts analyze what's happening in the economy. They identify the constraints, they come up with messages, they give it to the government, and the government acts. Now, the action on the part of the government, I found, has largely been incremental. So you suggest 5 or 6 things to the government, they do only 2. And then they see what the response of the entrepreneurs are. So this is a somewhat a conservative, a risk-averse, incremental approach. But then the entrepreneurs responded. That's a big thing about Bangladesh, the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit. Entrepreneurs responded, and growth happened, and then bottlenecks were faced again. And once again, the process started operating. People started talking about it, making recommendations. And once again, the government, whichever government was in power, would do 2 out of the 6 recommendations that were made. But if you can sustain this incremental approach over several decades, and that's exactly what happened in Bangladesh, then the accumulated results can be significant. And what I'm saying is that the reason the government may have gone for this somewhat conservative, risk-averse, incremental approach is that government itself was aware of the limitations that it had, the limitations of capacity, for example. So this may have been a pragmatic response to their own limitations. So what I'm saying is that we may lack the capacity in government to have a big bang approach. But let's remember what Hirschman said. When Albert Hirschman did a critique of the big push theory of development, this is exactly what he said. If governments had the capacity to do a big push, then those countries would not be underdeveloped in the first place. So he suggested the government does small incremental actions, but have good feedback loops. So that's very important. Have good feedback loops so that they know what's happening in the economy, and then they can have another set of interventions, again incremental, but another set of interventions as a follow-up. So I would say that I would not be tremendously concerned about the lack of capacity. I think it's the approach that you follow, the consistency of the approach over time across administrations, despite political turbulence, and very important, the feedback loops.
On that, let me posit a variation of what you've just said, all right, and seek your reaction. So, if the government's maintained macro stability, right? So sort of just basically you make sure that your currency is reasonably stable, or like not facing sudden depreciations. You maintain your external reserve in a kind of way, and you finance your budget deficits in conventional way. You don't print money, right? So if you do these basic things, so that gives you a certain kind of certainty, right? And you know that you are a weak government, or weak state, or sort of low capacity. You cannot really do the big push, or you cannot really do activist stuff, because if you did, you are going to get captured, state captured by crony capitalists and whatnot. So basically you keep stable money, stable banks, stable public finances, and then just see entrepreneurs do their thing. I mean, isn't that what we actually did in in a time that when things actually work. So if we go back from, say, early 90s to, before COVID. So last 2 years have been bad, but before that, as you said, we did have, reasonable 5%, 6% per capita income growth. I mean, that doubles your living standard every generation quite easily, right? So that's not bad.
No, but one might say that that's a necessary condition. A macro stability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition.
Because of the
So
feedback.
it might be useful to then again go back into the history of policymaking in Bangladesh, and I'll start from even earlier. So as you know, one of the very first development agendas of Bangladesh is to ensure food security through increasing agricultural production, and initially it was through increasing rice production. And we are fortunate that at the moment we become independent, that green revolution technology, HYV rice, had already come to our shores, and farmers had started adopting it on a very small scale. So what the government did was to make this a priority, that how can we make available to millions of farmers all over Bangladesh the inputs they needed for the high yielding variety rice, the seeds, the fertilizer, and also irrigation water. So that was going to be something new. So it cannot be just on the basis of natural irrigation as in the past. So that required a distribution mechanism. And initially it was a public sector model. And the Bangladesh Agricultural Development Corporation was tasked with the job. Yes, at the last mile, they had private dealers, etc., but it was largely a public sector model and a subsidized model. Okay. By the end of the 70s, it was becoming clearer that there were many inefficiencies in this system, whether it's corruption or other inefficiencies, etc. And that is where, when I mentioned the world of ideas, this is where researchers, including people in the BIDS, started doing some very good research, showing the problems with that system. And that started creating the pressure to reform the system. And then starting from the early 80s up to the early 90s, we see a series of reforms to liberalize the agricultural input market and bring in the private sector. And that, in a sense, also coincided with the opening up of Chinese imports. So we started getting very cheap irrigation pumps from China, and that also gave a very big boost to this. And then, if I may add, in the late 80s and going on to the 90s, there was a massive expansion of the rural road infrastructure in Bangladesh. So the first was policy reforms, and this is public investment. So now, yes, the fact that we maintain macro stability may have helped us get more returns out of these investments, but we certainly started seeing returns, at least in the rural front, from before 1990. And these kind of interventions were very, very useful. And then there were other interventions which came in later. And as I always talk about, the other function of government, which is the regulatory function. And there we have had problems, and we have problems even now.
Right. Again, Shafiq, I can ask questions about this all day long, but maybe you have something.
Yeah. So, Akhtar bhai, one thing is that there's a like an argument in development literature about whether countries should utilize their comparative advantage or defy its comparative advantage and or that development model. For example, there's a classic model is that Japan has no comparative advantage in producing cars, but but they went for that route and see where did it went. But as we see that our most in our export basket, it's a glaring that our most salient feature is that our over dependence on garments. It's about 84-85% garments, and so we clearly have a very good comparative advantage in producing garments, our country. So my question is that does that worry you? Is that does that worry you that we are so dependent on garments? And since we are went ahead with our comparative advantage in garments, if we want to diversify from garments, whether we should go to the defying comparative advantage route or go to the incremental route that we have been following and with varying success. So how do you see that we get out? I wouldn't say garments trap, but because it has been giving us a lot of benefits, and like our economic growth has been a lot dependent upon it. But
Sure.
does that worry you? Then how do we diversify from that?
Right. So firstly, there's another concept called dynamic comparative advantage, right? So you have static comparative advantage, and there's also something called dynamic comparative advantage. So you can acquire comparative advantage. And what these countries in East Asia have done is they have acquired that through a process of technological learning. So enterprises were encouraged not just to get modern machineries, but then try to learn how to make the best use of that machine. And there are many ways you can make use of a machine beyond the, the original intention of a machine. You can use it more productively. You can often use it to make more products. So in that process, through technological learning, you acquire certain degrees of comparative advantage, which you may not have started with. So that distinction between static and comparative dynamic needs to be kept in mind. So the technological learning to acquire dynamic comparative advantage is not necessarily defying your original comparative advantage, but you're building upon that to acquire additional comparative advantages. So I will use that framework to answer your question. Of course, I'm concerned about the over-dependence on garments. But let me start by saying that you are also very right that we not only have a comparative advantage, we have many years of experience of sort of working in the garment industry. And that experience is not only about the manufacturing or getting the workers together, setting up the factories, experience in financing these activities. So our financial sector has also gained a lot of experience in how you finance international trade, right? And there are certain other, we have developed market connections as well. And that's the reason why I'm less concerned that suddenly countries like countries in Africa, for example, or even in the Caribbean, can suddenly ramp up their garment production. It's not so easy to develop these capacities over time. Bangladesh has over 40 years. So we have that comparative advantage. And one might say, why not? And maybe you are also hinting at that. Why not continue to exploit that, right? After all, the global garment market is, of course, very large, and we are still, I mean, there's still much room for us to grow. So the first diversification would be diversification within garments. So you didn't mention that figure, but you hinted at that. It's about 83 to 84% of our total exports is garments. But there's another piece of statistics, which is about 75% of our garment exports comes from 5 categories of products: trousers, shirts, sweaters, etc. So even within garments, there is a lot of concentration. But at the same time, there are hundreds of garment products that our entrepreneurs have gone into, but the amounts are very small. So one of the questions is, can these non-traditional garment products be expanded over time using the competitive advantage that we have already acquired on garments? So that's one part of the diversification agenda. The second part is labor intensive but non-garment. We have products like leather products, there may be toys and other things, and there may be segments of the electronics industry which is also labor intensive. And the third would be to go into more sophisticated products. And sophisticated products are useful because if you go into products like electronics, you learn a lot of skills, which you can then use to go into other industries. The scope for that kind of learning is limited with simple products like garments or leather products, but much greater with sophisticated products. So we can go into those. So my answer would be that instead of trying to define competitive advantage, for example, by going into automobile production, maybe we can think of automobile parts, or maybe parts for the laptop that I'm using in conversing with you, right? So these would be acquiring new competitive advantage, building upon what we already have.
So let me play devil's advocate and say that if we try to do these other things, given our weak state capacity, so we go back to your earlier observation that sort of maintain macro stability that's necessary, but also you need it's not sufficient for that. You need feedback loop, you need ideas, and all of those things. if those things are not there, then there's a risk of state capture, right? So, basically, powerful rich people, the incumbents, basically, grab hold of the policy activism space and divert that for their own personal gain, right? So given that risk, and that risk is, it's not a theoretical risk. This has actually happened to us in last 5-10 years, right? So given that experience, you know, why, I mean, like, sort of that seems like a pretty recent bad experience. Why would that not scare you? Or, sort of, or what can we do to avoid that?
Right, right. And by the way, I don't think I completed my answer to Shafiq's question about why are we not being able to diversify, but I'll pick that up in a moment. Now, on state capture or crony capitalism, and I wrote one of my Dhaka Tribune columns was on this. I called it the 3 stages of crony capitalism.
Right.
And what we have seen from the experience of many countries, including Bangladesh, is that sometimes the government starts with a well-meaning, developmental-oriented approach where they want to ramp up activities. For example, doubling power capacity within 3 or 4 years of building infrastructure, or going into certain industrial activities on a big scale. And they think, and often rightly, that maybe there are some large enterprises which can deliver the goods. And if they are somehow politically on the right side, it just helps. But what they look initially is at the efficiency of these enterprises, the track record these enterprises had in the past. And they give these contracts to them, often through a non-competitive process. But these firms deliver, and therefore it's a positive sum game. So for example, electricity generation may have increased, and others also benefit. So that's why I call it a positive sum game. So that's the first stage. And you see the potential trap here, because the government is well-meaning, is developmental oriented, and therefore goes for this approach. But in the second stage, the cronies have now become used to getting privileges. So their efficiency drive becomes diluted. The model may still produce benefits for others. It may still be a positive sum game, but the efficiency drive has become less. And then you come to a stage where it becomes a zero-sum game. The cronies are now doing things, they're extracting resources, they're distorting policies, which is actually taking away value from other entrepreneurs. So that's why you become a zero-sum game. And I think something like that happened in Bangladesh, has happened in other countries. And I think your question is, how can we avoid that? And in order to avoid that, should we avoid taking that very first step of relying a lot on large enterprises? Now, the Koreans did it. I mean, the Korean development model relied a lot on the chaebols, right? But what they did and what we haven't done, they gave a lot of support to the companies, whether tax concessions, tariff protection, subsidized loans, you name it, it's a whole set of incentives. But the important thing is that these were linked to performance disciplines. And the idea was that we want you to achieve these things. If you can achieve these things, then you get the support, the incentives. And in some cases, the incentives came after you achieved. And in some cases, it may have been ex ante, that, okay, we are giving you these things because you need these, the support right now. But a year later or 6 months later, we are going to come back and look at what you have achieved. And the thing about Korea is that they were very ruthless in withdrawing the subsidies. And it doesn't matter if it was a very big chaebol. And that's why some people say that it's not so much that Korea was good at picking winners. Korea was good at weeding out the losers.
Right.
And that's not something we have done. So what we have done, therefore, is we keep on giving subsidies to maintain the status quo. What the Koreans did was use subsidies to bring about change. So then the question would be, can a state without strong capacity, with potential cronies lurking around you, can a government institute this kind of policy? My submission would be that maybe this is the kind of steps that we can expect in terms of stronger reforms. So we may not be able to expect a very strong government which can guarantee us that it will never become, it will never succumb to these interests. But at the same time, we can move to another set of arrangements where these kind of disciplines are imposed. And that's why in the task force report, of which I was a member, we talked about redefining the relationship between government and the private sector. And there are some other elements to it, and I can come back to it later.
It was going to be actually one of my follow-up questions about the task force, but Shofik has his hands up. So let's hear from Shofik, and then I'll come back to that one. Yes. Shofik.
Yeah, relating on the same point that between Korea and I see that I read your article in the Daily Star that I see that like we got like two routes. Like one is the Korea route, another is like the India route. You know that in India that you see that these big companies like Reliance, Adani, and many other companies were given favor and like from the state in terms of like low like financing or just different non-competitive contracts and other things. But to some extent, these companies also delivered because a lot of the things that you said, that the coordination problems, the financing problems, the information problems, these companies, entrepreneurs solved this on their own. Like government didn't have to do it. Like Reliance Group and other groups, they went into a new industry. For example, Reliance Group went into petrochemical, and they invested a lot. And India has become like a big player in the petrochemical oil refinery and those things. So in a way, these companies solved a lot of the things that the Indian government were not able to do or not able to do. And but we see that in India, the state capture to happen to a large extent. That we know that India has a problem of the state capture of this the government, the politics being becoming beholden to these big oligarchs. But our case was much worse than India because our, as you said, that after some extent, the big companies they went into a zero sum game and they started looting the state whole scale, like there's no tomorrow and everything is gonna sell. So, in my opinion, like the Korea route is like I think it's little bit a breeze too far for us, a goal too far us. We don't have that legacy of state capacity and everything. But how about those India model? Like, can Bangladesh government play like a good role in supervising like good winners, good players, like let them become rich, but see that they become rich and enrich the country too. Is it possible to Bangladesh to follow the India route more positively?
Well, I will not necessarily label this as a India route, but I'll come back to what I was mentioning, that imposing performance disciplines on any support that is given to the private sector. Excuse me. So I think this is a very important design question that we have, and maybe you can also pitch in and give your comments. So on the one hand, I think we are all agreeing that it may be too much for us to expect a Korea-like government. Not that the Korean government or the Vietnamese government don't have their problems. You see these anti-corruption drives in Vietnam from time to time, and there were serious allegations of corruption, even in recent times in Korea, involving even the very top of the administration. So they had all those problems. And therefore, it's very interesting to study why, despite all those problems, they did deliver on certain things. So these kind of practices, like the one I mentioned, that let's have performance disciplines associated with the granting of any support to the private sector. Can we start by experimenting with these kind of approaches? Whether this is a bit more feasible than trying to go the South Korea route. And here I will want to invoke Hirschman again in a different way, in the sense that if you're thinking of a big bang reforms in government, and if we agree that that may be rather difficult for us to achieve, is it possible in the Hirschmanian sense to think of certain interventions which may be feasible, but which, if you carry them out, may trigger certain dynamics, certain economic dynamics, but also certain governance dynamics in the system, which will then create demand for further reforms. So I'm just thinking aloud, and I would love to hear your reactions, that given our skepticism about the possibilities of Big Bang reforms, shall we instead start thinking along Hashmanian lines, think about a few interventions, but do that creatively, which has the highest potential of inducing a demand for further reforms? So this inducing demand for further reforms could be a criteria for deciding what kind of interventions you go for now.
And the
But I wonder
variation,
whether you, Jyoti and Shafiq, have any thoughts on this.
I have a thought, Shafiq, if I may, and then you can come in after that, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, you're perfectly right. I'm a big fan of Hirschman too. He has been one of the core, a bedrock of my thesis work, and particularly his input-output tables and those kind of things, those backward and forward linkage
Right,
and those
right.
things. And I actually like one of my thesis is underpinned by the factor that we mentioned about the garments, about the garments dependence. One of the problem of the garments industry is that although we have developed the financing instruments and other things, but you know that garments industry has very few technological overlap with other industries. So compared to other industries, for example, chemical or electronics, particularly chemical is mentioned is often as a very much like a core industry. If you develop expertise in core industry, because chemical is input to a lot of industries, then this technological expertise automatically goes into the other industries. But similarly, I was thinking that even in software and other places, there are few core industries which if they are developed, they have got a large spillover effect in other industries. But unfortunately, garments is an industry that doesn't have that spillover linkage effect with other industries at all. So we have become very efficient producer in the world in garments, but unfortunately, a lot of our other industries have not benefited from that skill, that expertise. So you are quite right that we need to identify and focus what are our advantages and which industries that we can focus on that can give us these linkage effects, this that technology and learning, all this effect can spill over to other industries, to the broader economy. So I'm very much for
Right.
that, like a Hirschmanian
Okay.
model.
Uh-huh. But you have brought the concept of linkages to another thing, which I actually, by the way, when I mentioned sophisticated, complex
Yeah,
activities, I was thinking along the same lines as you. So there are activities which are sort of isolated in the product map from
yeah,
others, and therefore getting expertise in that, like garments, doesn't give you the skills or learning to think about other industries. But there are others like the chemicals or maybe parts of semiconductor, where you acquire the skills to then branch into other industries. So the linkage effect is strong. The linkage that I was referring to here is in the policy space, in the reform space, which is that if you carry out, so we are starting with the assumption that there isn't a tremendous demand, a very strong demand within and outside the government to carry out very bold reforms. So we are starting from that assumption, right? So what do you do when the demand is not very strong and the internal capacity and appetite of the government to carry out bold reforms is not strong? So there the approach could be the Hashmanian one, that you select certain reforms which have a high linkage effect in the sense that it creates dynamics to induce demand for further reforms, right? So that same concept, I'm wondering whether we can apply it to the reform space.
And that brings me to so that makes me think about two things. One is this is somewhat related to the the whole Danny Roderick growth diagnostics kind of thing. That look sort of you cannot do Big Bang reform or sort of shock therapy kind of stuff because politics is just too hard. But maybe you can identify that, okay, look, here is my binding constraint. It could
Mhm.
be low revenue, or it could be law and order, it could be the ports or whatever, right? And you said that, okay, look, sort of this is one thing. If I unlocked that, that could open the door for other things. So I think you are hinting at something like that. And then the other thought is in
Well,
practical
a
terms.
little bit different from that, but I'll come back to you. But
Sure.
go
Yeah.
on.
Okay. And the other thought is, bringing it, sort of practical to Bangladesh in 2025, and this brings to your experience with the task force for economic reprioritization. And you mentioned that, like, sort of one of the chapters that I believe you wrote was about institutions. But again, Shofik has his hands up, so I'll I'll pause there for those things. But
Yeah.
Shofik, yeah.
No. I was just like I got just fired up with Akhtar Bhai's suggestion about those linkage effect in policy space. That seems like a very interesting and obviously good idea because I remember seeing those input output tables that Hirschman used from the 1950s, like those vast big tables when there's no automation, like they all did that input output of different industries and through hundreds of columns and hundreds of rows, thousands of rows actually, very huge tables. So here, as Akhtar Bhai suggested previously, that there's a three input there, and one is that policy space, the idea space. This is where perhaps I don't know, has anybody done it, but maybe we should try to map out all the government rules and regulations and everything that affect linked upon one another, and how much which rule how much affect other one, and if we can map out all these government rules, and then we can see that how much tweaking, how much changing rules here and there, which we can identify which rules have the more bigger effect, which rules need changing. I don't know whether anybody has tried that in the rule space in Bangladesh, but it seems a very much worthwhile thing to do and not a too difficult thing to do in today's network like software and other environment.
Well, first, Shafiq, I'm glad that you got fired up with this idea because I would really like this to be a collective effort where at least some of us start thinking whether we can identify certain reforms which are reasonably feasible, but which has the potential to, as I said, induce demand for further reforms. So I think this is an area where we can do some collective thinking. I will respond to your comment, Shafiq, in the context of the task force recommendations on whether anyone has done that kind of exercise with regulations. But Jyoti, on your reference to Danny Roderick and the binding constraint concept, now I was thinking about a certain twist to that, which is you may identify a binding constraint, and the policy intervention required to address that binding constraint may be quite challenging. So in that case, is there a scope to do something which is more feasible, which doesn't address the binding constraint, but which sets in motion that Hashmanian process
Right.
of inducing demand, which eventually will help us address the binding constraint, perhaps.
Perhaps.
So here the binding constraint was more the capacity and commitment of the government.
Right.
So I was thinking of something which is a bit more feasible. Okay. So coming to
Absolutely.
the, sorry, you were saying something?
No, I'm saying that. No, I'm agreeing with you. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So on the task force, first just to give you a background of why that the committee was commissioned by Professor Waiduddin Mahmood, the planning advisor. So he did this in his capacity as planning advisor, not in his capacity as education advisor. So he has scrapped the 5-year plan, which, by the way, had only 1 year left, but still had 1 year left. And he wasn't planning to write a 5-year plan. The next government can come and do one if it wants. So when he commissioned this report, which was in September, I think the government still had roughly at least 6-7 months, maybe a year's horizon ahead of them. So there were things to be done. And he was telling me when he invited me to join the committee that there are a lot of projects in the pipeline. And the government has the option of either proceeding with those or abandoning them or modifying them. And donors, development partners were also coming in with proposals. So he needed a filter through which he was going to look at all these proposals. And he said one of the things that our report can do is to give him food for thought for that filter. And in that context, he said, if there are quick wins that you can suggest, please do so, but don't confine yourself just to the quick wins. This should be a report about re-strategizing the economy in the mid to long term. So, and that's exactly what we try to do. So I was involved in two chapters. One is, which was chapter 4, which was about the manufacturing sector, the future of the manufacturing sector, which I wrote with Selim Raihan and Nasim Manzoor had several inputs. And there was one on governance, which I think you referred to as the institutional one. So it had two parts: the institutional governance, which was written largely by our team leader, K.A.S. Murshid, and the economic governance section which was written by me. So on the economic governance, that's where we were talking about redefining the relationship between government and the private sector. So I mentioned we mentioned three or four things there. One is the one which I just mentioned on the regulatory interface. And we had a specific important proposal. I'll come to that in a moment. The second was I also mentioned that, imposing performance disciplines on any support the government gives to the private sector. But the third was about the government enhancing the degree of competition in the marketplace. And I've written about this separately as well, the government's capacity to understand the markets and understand the market economy, I think, is still very limited. And that's why often you will see when prices go up in the market, you send these magistrates with a horde of TV cameras, and then nothing happens, right? We talk of syndicates, and maybe there are syndicates in some places, and maybe there aren't syndicates in other places. But this obsession with syndicates means that we are ignoring certain fundamental dynamics of markets. And not just the supply-demand dynamics, which we all read about in first-year economics, but the role of market expectations. And this is something we don't try to understand. The market players are driven by expectations. And if you can shape those expectations, you might be able to steer them in certain directions. And there are occasions when that has happened, when government gave a signal that they're going to import certain commodities in a big way or open up import. That changed the expectations and prices started falling even before the imports actually came. So the question then is, how can the government enhance its capacity to understand the market? Where can the capacity be housed initially? And we thought about the Competition Commission, which I thought was a good initiative, but I think it has turned out to be a prosecutorial agency rather than an agency which tries to understand markets and advocate for competition policies within the government. That's what competition policies are primarily responsible for. The prosecutorial function is there as well, but here it has become the most important function. So that's similar to sending magistrates in the market. It's the same control, going after you mentality, rather than trying to understand you first and then steer you through very creative, intelligent policies. So these were the kind of things. But on regulation, and this will respond partly to Shafiq's point, we are proposing the creation, or in a sense, a revival, because we did have that before, a regulatory reform commission. Now, why are we talking about? What will the commission do? So one of the things it will do is the kind of exercise that Shafiq was asking about. Take a stock of all the rules and regulations in the country. See how many of them are redundant, because many of them are redundant. Many are duplicative, and make a proposal to get rid of all this. And the ones which remain, how do you improve the processes of administering the regulations and complying with the regulations, right? That exercise may also do what Shafiq was asking about, which is to look at these linkages between regulations. And are there certain regulations which are more binding than others in terms of creating problems for the private sector? And if you can reform that, then would some of the other regulatory issues become redundant or easier to solve? So I think he was trying to apply the Hashmanian approach to doing a stock taking of regulation. Now, I don't think we can rely on the line ministries to carry out these kind of exercises, or even identifying regulatory gaps, which I think is something very important. Because we always talk about regulatory hassles, right? But there are many cases where we don't have the regulations. So Uber is a good example. When Uber came a few years ago, the government was totally confused. Is this a taxi company? Should it be regulated as an internet company? Because the rule books did not have rules to deal with these kind of changes. But these kind of changes are going to come, new business models, new technologies, And we better be prepared for something that may come 2 years from now and see whether the rule books are able to deal with those. So regulations are important. I remember, I think it was Jamie Dimon or someone who was asked in the wake of the crisis of 2000, 2008, he was asked something and he replied with a rhetorical question. Why do motor cars have brakes? The obvious answer is so that you can bring it to a stop. And he said, it was a very counterintuitive answer, but a brilliant answer, so that motor cars can drive very fast. Now, why is that? If you know your brakes are of very high quality and you can bring your car to a full stop within a second from 100 miles to 0, you are emboldened to drive faster. The same is true of businesses. If the rules are clarified through nicely written rules and regulations, you are emboldened to take risks and go into new ventures. So regulations are also important. But to sort out all these issues, I don't think we can leave it to the line ministries. And that's why we argued for a regulatory reform commission. And let me just say that Korea did something like this with exactly the same name in 1998 in the wake of the financial crisis. Mexico did in 2000. And 2 days after our report was submitted to Professor Yunus, the chief advisor, the Indian government announced its budget for the next year, and it announced the formation of a regulatory reform committee. It's just a pure coincidence. We can't claim credit for that. But what it shows is that governments have been moving away from ad hoc approaches to regulatory reform to more systematic approaches. And I think the time has come for us. We tried this actually in 2007, but sadly it was discontinued for whatever reason.
Well, that brings me, I was actually thinking exactly that Dr. Akbar Ali Khan led one such effort back in 2007-8, and obviously didn't have the buy-in from the incoming government. Now, how do we make sure? How do we avoid that experience? With the future incoming government.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, that how do we stop turning a regulatory reform commission into a full-blown regulatory prosecutorial agency, the way the competition policy has sort of gone. So how do we avoid those things?
Right. Well, that's a design issue, and of course, socializing these ideas with the political parties. Now, if BNP comes to power, and if Amin Khosrow Mahmood Chowdhury sticks to his promise, because at the conference we had on the task force report, he was there in the first session, and he said, if we come to power, there will be complete liberalization. So you may not even need the Regulatory Reform Commission for more than a month. But I think, well, if the political parties are talking to the business people, when we were having the consultations for the task force report, this thing came up again and again and again, every time there was a business person in the room, in the consultation, the regulatory hassles. So if whoever comes to power is willing to listen to the private sector and respond, they won't be able to escape the idea of regulatory reforms. And then the question is, can we leave it to the line ministries, or do we need an arrangement like this? So first, appreciate the importance of regulatory reforms. And that will be very difficult not to if we really are listening to the business sector, and then come up with the right institutional structure.
Shafiq.
Yeah, I think this is where the thing that a lot of us has been pushing for, like a PR upper house where political parties can bring in real experts. That can help us a lot, because we are thinking that like a PR upper house would have a lot of role in these independent commissions. For example, you know that in USA the senators, for example, Senator Warren and a lot of other people, everyone has that their own develop own expertise in different regulatory and different expert areas of consumer protection and other areas, and they pushed the bureaus and other that, and they did a job, different kind of jobs with varying success. So as you said that we cannot depend upon line ministries to regulate these. They will be soon captured, and because they got their own dynamic. So probably an upper house that is staffed by real experts from the not constituency politicians who can do a more better supervisory roles of these commissions like
Right. And by the way, you have actually just introduced another interesting topic, which is a synergy between what is being discussed in the sort of the political governance space of reforms, where much of our discussion is nowadays, and the space for economic reforms. And this, what we just discussed in the last few minutes, is an example of what you want on the economic side. Whether you get it will also depend, at least partly, on the political and governance side, right? At the same time, as an economist, someone who's thinking about economic policy reforms, we also have to prepare for a scenario where we may not end up with very bold reforms on the political governance side. We may end up with a situation where the economic management, economic policy framing, and the economy continues to go on a muddling through approach, which has been historically our approach. And therefore, how can you get better results from a muddling through approach, or are there better versions of a muddling through approach? So there's one side of me which is thinking along those lines based on my research on the historical experience with policy reforms in Bangladesh. But what you're saying is, here is an example of why it is important to think about bold reforms on the political governance side, because those are needed for the economic policy reforms as well.
So, linking it with politics, I recall you had also written in the past about qualities of a good finance minister or good econocrats or economic, policymakers. What would you like to see? What attributes would you like to see in finance ministers and planning ministers or commerce ministers in a future incoming elected government?
Okay. I don't know which article you're referring to, but I do remember one I wrote during the past regime, which was about when we saw that the cabinet was increasingly being dominated by technocrats, and what I call the seasoned politicians were
That's the
gradually
one.
being weeded out, right?
Yes.
And the point I made there was that, yes, you can have some technocrats in the cabinet, you can have some bureaucrats because they bring certain experience and expertise, which is useful. But I was talking about the balance, and I thought those cabinets had become seriously imbalanced in the sense that the presence of seasoned politicians was becoming almost zero in the economic management team. So I think I referred to the 12 most important economic managers, which included half a dozen ministers, the governor of the central bank, the finance secretary, NBA chairman, all of that. Some of them were bureaucrats by definition, but others did not have to be that. And my point was that seasoned politicians have at least two qualities. One is the feedback loops they have, extensive feedback loops into the society, and therefore they get information from many different angles, and then the ability to process them, the ability to think about the trade-offs. But they also have empathy, and not only empathy for poor people, empathy for large businesses as well. I mean, something in their mind tells them, okay, I've also have to understand where that person is coming from. And empathy, we normally associate it as a soft characteristic, but actually it can be a very strong characteristic because empathy also helps you become courageous. That's my submission, that if you have a lot of empathy, then you can also take bold actions. So I said that these are things which a seasoned politician has. And if you have a scarcity of seasoned politicians in your economic management team, that's going to be a deficiency for you. Okay, so that's what I wrote. But starting from that, I'll come to this. So ideally, you may have a finance minister who is a seasoned politician, but at least has the desire to listen to the technocrats and then the ability to sort out the trade-offs. Now, one of our former finance secretaries, when I had a very interesting chat with him 2 years ago, he said, after describing various reforms that happened when he was finance secretary, he said, Akhtar, do you know when reforms happen? I said, no, tell me. He said, reforms happen when politicians know a little bit of economics and economists know a little bit of politics. And I can substitute economists with technocrats, and the same will hold. So how will politicians know a little bit of economics? And how will economists know a little bit of politics? So it means for economists, at least, in addition to learning about political dynamics, also learn the language of presenting your proposals in a way that a politician will understand the economics of that. So I think deep political experience, but combined with the willingness to listen to different stakeholders in society, listen to what the experts are saying, but then do the political calculations, the trade-offs in a very efficient way, and of course the thickness of your skin, because I think it's correct that a popular finance minister is not necessarily a good finance minister.
Yes. His job is his or her job. Their job is to say no, right?
Yes,
Everybody wants
exactly,
to spend money, and your job is to say no.
exactly.
You don't have money. So I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
and yet at the end of the day, when the dust has settled, if people go back and say no, he or she actually did good things for us,
they
and
listen.
that would be the quality of a good finance
Yes.
minister.
Okay. We have gone past an hour, and we try to keep these things, because otherwise people set in from the
Right.
fray. But we could. I'm hoping that we do this again because
Well, I'd
there's
love to. It was
more.
a.
Yes.
I mean, I did most of the talking. Maybe next time we'll have more of a
But,
real conversation.
but in the meantime, Shafiq, do you have any last thoughts, last questions, and then we'll go back to Akhtar Bhai you for our last thought.
No, not at this moment, but thank you very much. Yeah, you did most of the talking because we are just eager to pick your brains. And it was very illuminating, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and you both asked very very thought-provoking questions. Though I think I can. Um, But one point I didn't mention is the importance of data at the end of the day. And I'll
Right.
just say one thing, two things really. One is that there's actually a whole lot of data in government. Government agencies have to collect a lot of data as part of their routine work. And I suspect 90% of that is unused or underutilized. So that's one thing. And the other is there's a lot of data being generated in the private sector. Telecom companies, for example, have a lot of data, and I'm sure there are many other logistics companies have a lot of data, which are also very, very useful. And there should be ways to tap those data as well and make sense out of that. And the idea of having leading indicators, which can give us some indication of what's going to come. So although I know that there are three kinds of lies, statistics, sorry, what was it? Lies, uh, uh, what, yeah, there was something, damn lies and statistics.
Right.
But still, I'll make a pitch for collecting more statistics.
Absolutely. Shafiq.
No, I just wanted to endorse your view because anyone who has done research in economy in the global context and also in for Bangladesh sees that how data poor our country is like that. Like if you go into like any other countries, you see data from all kind of production, business, commerce, government data everywhere. So like there's a plethora of data, and Bangladesh not only had data scarcity or reliability of data. So uh, like that's one of the very important inputs for development. Like generate lot of data, get those data into public domain so that the people who are experts can go over them and see, analyze them, process them. So that's a very important thing that you pointed out.
I think the onus is also on the private sector. I mean, ask yourself, how much data has the garment industry shared with the public? How much do we know about the industry actually in terms of granular data? So the onus lies on all the players.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to pause today, but Akhtar Bhai, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll definitely come back and sort of have longer conversations or series of conversations in future.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I really thought this was a very stimulating conversation. Thank you, Shafiq, as well.
Sure. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. Stop. You sure you want to stop?